Yeah. Welcome back from lunch, everybody. We'll be shifting gears into post-fire recovery with Maya and Logan, and I'll turn it over to them for some introductions and the next presentation.
Mute.
And Maya, you're muted.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you all had a great lunch. My name is Maya Corliss. I am the Regional Fire Planner for Fish and Wildlife Service Pacific Region.
Hey everybody, Logan McCrae here, Oregon Department of Forestry. I'm the LeGrand and Baker Unit Forester. That's my day job. And post-fire recovery team is a team that we have been implementing here for the Oregon Department of Forestry to help assist private landowners post-wildfire. And I've been one of the leads on that team. So that's why I'm helping with this presentation today.
Thanks, Logan. All right, so today we're going to be talking about post-wildland fire rehabilitation and recovery. Another word for this is ESR, Emergency Stabilization and Burn Area Rehabilitation. And this program serves as the bridge between a wildfire event and long-term restoration. So today I'll give you a general overview of the ESR program. And if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we will address questions at the end if we have time after you get done with your group exercise. All right, we're going to define the roles of agency administrators and fire management officers when it comes to post-fire rehab and recovery. We will clarify suppression repair, turnback standards, burned area emergency response, emergency stabilization, burned area rehabilitation, and long-term recovery and restoration. And for all of these, we'll try to provide examples for direction and implementation. The purpose of post-fire emergency stabilization and rehabilitation, ESR, is to reduce risk to public safety and protect critical resources, repair minor assets, and restore landscapes unlikely to recover naturally. Each wildland fire management agency is responsible for taking prompt action to determine the need for ESR on the lands that they manage after a wildfire. This is a list of manuals and guidebooks that provide direction for ESR. I made a separate Word document for all of you that's in the learning portal right now that has all of these references and some websites so that you don't have to screenshot this slide and remember everything. The important thing that I want you to take away from this slide is that there are agency-specific guidebooks and manuals for ESR, and you as the agency administrator or FMO are going to need to know which ones apply to you and who to contact if you don't know. All right, and this clip at the bottom here that you can see is a short YouTube video that gets us thinking about why emergency stabilization can be very important post-fire. And Logan's going to put that link in the chat for everyone. It's a few minutes long, and sharing is going to be a bit iffy through the presentation. So if everybody could go ahead and take a couple minutes, click on the link, then watch it on your own and be back here in about 3 minutes. That'd be great. Okay, that should have been about enough time for you to get the picture about why emergency stabilization can be critical post-fire. All right, post-wildfire recovery consists of suppression repair, emergency stabilization, burn area emergency response, which we'll be calling BEAR, burn area rehabilitation, and restoration. And essentially, ES and BEAR are the same program, just viewed a little differently. For example, the Forest Service describes their ES program as BEAR, while the Interior uses BEAR as the response to start the ES process. ES and BEAR are synonymous terms, and basically the difference between ES, BEAR, and BAR is the emergency component. And it's important to note that BEAR is not always necessary, and just because you have a fire on your unit doesn't necessarily mean you're going to need to initiate the BEAR process. We'll explain what each of these means later on in the slides. And then lastly, the agency administrator is responsible for all of these programs. However, they may delegate authority for suppression repair to the incident commander. This is a good illustration of the major differences between the objectives, timeframes, responsibility, and funding for each program. Like I said before, suppression repair is not always as simple as illustrated, or is not always as simple. And that's why here, let me get my pen, laser pointer. That's why you see an ellipsis here where it says the responsibility for suppression repair is the incident commander. This responsibility gets delegated from the agency administrator. The important thing about this slide that I want you to take away as the FMO or AA is to remember that there are different timelines for each of these programs, and the earlier you start working on your plans, the quicker you get them approved and funded. ESR addresses a broad range of issues. These are a few examples of things you need to be thinking about. Human life and safety should always be #1 priority. Soil water stabilization, invasive plants, weed treatments. And remember that all treatments must comply with your approved land management plan. For example, pesticide use for revegetation is allowed only under emergency stabilization if it's already in your approved land management plan and has an existing program. You don't have to memorize all of these, just know that your treatments need to already be accounted for in your land management plans. All right, let's start talking about the basic stages of the fire and how ESR fits into the mix. So when the fire starts, you should be thinking about whether you're going to need reed or reef support. Reeds are resource advisors, and reefs are resource advisors that are fire lane qualified, which means they don't need an escort when working in the fire area. They work directly for the agency administrator and can provide support to the IC, the incident commander, or the IMT in charge of the fire. Now, if you have multiple reeds on your incidents or reefs, you may need to designate a REAS, which is a resource advisor coordinator, formerly known as the lead reed. And these also work directly for the AA. You should already know your values at risk and the impact based on the time of year, and you should know where your sensitive resources are on your unit. As the fire escapes initial attack, you should be thinking about identifying an ESR project or planning lead, organizing an IDT to handle any NEPA, and continuing to identify areas of concern and priorities. You need to be thinking about what you want your mop-up, turn-back standards, and suppression repair plan to look like. And this is where pre-season planning can be really helpful. This course stresses the importance of good working relationships and a collaborative approach to planning. And so having pre-season conversations with your FMO partners and adjacent landowners will help you pre-populate some of this language, which could be a good reference when it comes time to actually build some of these plans that we're going to talk about. As you get on what IMT is often referred to as your glide path to containment, when things with the fire are ramping down, make sure to start coordinating early with your supervisor's office or regional ES-bar contact so that they know to expect a plan for a signature. The agency administrator is ultimately responsible for plan development, so hopefully you've already front-loaded your contacts when the fire escaped initial attack about the possibility of needing ES-bar. I really want to stress this part because for me, for example, I am the point of contact for Fish and Wildlife Service for my region for anything ES-bar. And when we have a fire where our agency administrator or FMO thinks that they're going to need ESR, they give me a call right away and let me know that they're going to start drafting a plan. And this gives me time to call our national coordinator, let him know to expect a plan to come across his desk for a signature in the near future. And then once I get a draft plan, I call him back and let him know how much we're going to be requesting. And that also, since he already is expecting a plan, he's waiting to see how much it costs. And then once I give him that figure, he's able to go ahead and brief the fire director on the situation. And it gives him time to look at the requests coming in from the other agencies to see where our project would line out in, or rank out, I mean, in priority. And then ultimately, all of this work that I do in the background for the AA and FMO helps expedite the signature process. And I'm sure I don't have to tell a lot of you in the room how much of a frustration it can be when you're trying to get signatures in a timely manner. So just really want to stress that part here. Reaching out early, knowing who to contact, that will be key to success when it comes to ESR. And please don't forget when you're drafting your plans to consider your workload prioritization and what it actually takes to implement. I see a lot of plans come across my desk and with other agencies that are very difficult to implement. And this is really key because if you write a plan that's not implementable, it's basically worthless. And so for agency administrators that are maybe unfamiliar with some of these processes, I would highly suggest that you have that conversation with your FMO and lean on your reads and FMOs when it comes to designing treatments, because they're most likely going to be your subject matter experts for implementation. All right, once you've made it through the glide path to contain and controlled, and now the fire has been declared out and you're in post-fire recovery mode, these are the things that you need to really focus on. Just remember, with all things, change is constant, so be flexible. Hopefully by now you have or are close to having an approved plan. Once the plan is approved and money's been allocated, you can start spending money implementing your treatments, as only if it's safe to do so, because remember, safety is priority one. I highly recommend that you keep detailed notes on any money spent, successful treatments, problems, challenges, because this is going to help you later on with your annual reporting and any amendments that you need. And I would just be prepared ahead of time to write amendments. These plans have to be written fast, and oftentimes you end up realizing once you get into implementation that you need additional funding, and keeping these detailed notes it's what's going to help you get that funding. And don't forget to reach out to your neighboring agencies and partners throughout this process, if applicable. All right, I realize that we referenced a lot of plans in there without explaining what the detail about the plans. So that was just a brief overview of the different stages of the fire and how ESR can fit into the picture. And now we're going to get into the specifics of the different plans. And as I mentioned earlier, you should be working on your mop-up, turn-back standards, and suppression repair plan once the fire escapes initial attack. And this is where I will hand it over to Logan to explain a little bit more detail about these plans.
Great, thanks, Maya. Okay, so first what we're going to do is we're going to differentiate between mop-up and suppression repair. I would imagine a lot of you folks know what mop-up is, but just wanted to draw that direct line. So a lot of times the IMT that is on the fire and has the delegation of authority, they're going to be in charge of mop-up and suppression repair, but there is a line between the two. So actually continuing to put the fire out, mop-up is a suppression activity itself. It can be lengthy depending on what type of fuels and where you're at, where your fire exists. If it's light fuels, it might be a couple days. If you're in Western Oregon, it might be weeks or sometimes even months. And so that's going to happen prior to full containment. Next slide, Maya. And then we have suppression repair. So containment around a fire happens on a continuum. The whole fire doesn't just all of a sudden get contained all at once. And so as individual pieces of the fire become contained, then we can start looking at what those suppression repair activities are going to be needed out there on the fire line. So Maya hit on this already. Really important once the fire escapes containment and initial attack, and there's going to be an IMT showing up. Really good idea to start working on what those turnback standards would be, and ensuring if it's a multi-jurisdiction fire that we're working on developing turnback standards, including this suppression repair plan, along with our partners, so that we can hand over one document that addresses, hopefully, I guess that would be the goal, is to hand over one suppression repair and turnback standards document for the entire fire. So it's a very clear and concise set of marching orders for that IMT from all of the AAs. So some examples of suppression repair would include, but they're not limited to, seating staging areas, water bars on hand and dozer lines, fence and gate repairs, and weed treatments. A lot of the suppression repair activities are going to be very similar across federal ownerships and also a lot of private land ownerships, depending on the jurisdiction. These are delegated to the team, and although it's the IMT's responsibility to take care of these suppression repair actions and carry them out, I believe it's very important that the local district and the local units be involved and be available for consulting with the team. I think it's important to remember that the fire team and the operational folks that are out there leading a lot of the work that's happening and a lot of the firefighting equipment that's going to be involved in the suppression repair activities, their primary goal and their primary job is typically fighting fire and less so on the suppression repair and water bar. And so having that local contact, whether that's the resource advisors out there, or for us on the private side, it'd be probably our forester group of folks, having those people available to the team is very important. It's important while you're developing these turnback standards and the suppression repair activities, focus on what is accomplishable given the situation that you have, and have that discussion with the agency, your partner agency administrators. Lost the page. Did you jump ahead, Maya? Are we on? Okay.
You
Yes.
already covered a lot of the parts in this slide.
Okay, great. Great. Yep. So turn back standards, they're going to include what that mop up looks like. A lot of time, mop up is just a riding around the perimeter of the fire. You're looking at limiting further disturbance to critical resources that are out there on the fire. And then suppression repair, you're talking about the suppression actions that occurred out there on the fire, the damage that those caused. How can we fix those up, and that's the first step in emergency stabilization of that ground, and making sure that we can reduce and mitigate the negative impacts of those suppression efforts. Part of the turn back standards, safety concerns, so that could be snag mitigation along infrastructure, roadways, power lines in and around communities, logistical concerns, wrapping up fire camps and the like, clean finance packages, planning. What is the, who are you handing this over to? Who are you handing the fire over to? Maybe it's an incoming type 3 team, and the agency administrators can work together to ensure that that IMT has a smooth transition over to the incoming smaller team or smaller organization. And then public information, how do you want that stuff wrapped up? So I think an important one on the turn back standards is remember what that means. That means that we're turning that back to the local unit and the local districts. And so being very clear and concise from an agency administrator perspective, making sure that the team knows exactly what type of package that you want to have, that you want to reassume control over once they leave. That's very important. Okay, next slide. Primary goal mop-up standards are to ensure the fire perimeter is secured to a level that reduces the risk of fire escape, while minimally impacting the resource mitigating risk and exposure to firefighters. Definitely important to weigh future as you're mopping up. We want to limit the amount of additional damage that we're causing, but also weigh that with making sure that we're actually keeping the fire contained. Because if the fire gets away and we got to go chase it again, there's going to be an additional amount of suppression damage that happens. Wildfire rehabilitation, mitigate or eliminate environmental resource impacts caused by fire suppression efforts and rehabilitate the area as natural conditions as possible. So wanted to also, as we drew a line between mop up and suppression repair, wanted to also draw a line between suppression repair and rehab. I know from a lot of state perspectives, rehab is something that the state cannot pay for. However, we can pay for the suppression repair. So that rehabilitation piece of it, and Maya's going to talk quite a bit more about that in the upcoming portion of the presentation. That's going to, a lot of times that's where goals and objectives will begin to diverge. Okay, next slide. So just I'll double hit on the second bullet there. Minimize digging and further disturbance in areas of known sensitive plants, critical wildlife habitat, wilderness study areas, and other sensitive areas. Important to not damage those further. Also weighing those, weighing the risk of losing the fire and having to go back and chase it again, incurring more suppression damage as we go along. Next slide. Okay, so as far as suppression repair activities go in those turn back standards, and we hit on this early, staging areas, turnaround, landing zones, these places, they can get pretty nuked out. A lot of disturbance down to bare mineral soil. Working with your local unit and the team to identify what you want those areas to look like, and also understanding that you can mitigate the resource concerns, but likely you can't eliminate the concerns and the negative impacts that have happened. And so trying to find a good balance there. Fire line, when it comes to hand lines are a little bit easier to rehab. A lot of times you're putting water bars in them, throwing brush in, that sort of thing. So that'll be included in the turnback standard. Dozer lines, you're likely you'll use equipment to install those water bars, or to put vegetation back on those dozer lines using excavators or hand crews. Either one of those work. Roadside work and road repair, a lot of damage can happen to the road systems that are out there across whether they're county, state, federal, or private roads. And so what are the agency administrators needing to see as far as repair to those roads? What does that look like? Noxious and exotic weeds, weed wash stations, that sort of thing, and concerns. Maybe that's grass seeding to help out compete exotic or noxious weeds, reestablishing quickly after a disturbance, taking care of the hazard trees, and cleaning up the closures and evacuations, turning those back to a point where the area is safe and folks can go back in there. So that is, I guess, one last thing that I'll hit on. A lot of these activities are taken on by that team and the resources and the equipment that's on scene. Very inefficient to have a bunch of that equipment demob because there isn't a clear plan that's been handed over to the IMT. Having that equipment demob and then having to reorder it. So getting in front of it with a clear set of turnback standards, including all of the things that each agency is looking for, is very important for the IMTs, so that they can be thinking about that early on, even before the fire's contained. That's what I had.
Thanks, Logan. Okay. All right, so before you take immediate action post-fire, you need to consider whether your situation is an emergency and whether or not your agency policy is going to support that. Burn area, so BEAR, essentially is the program designed to address the emergency. And emergency is highlighted in this slide because that's the component I really want you to take away from this. BEAR is addressing the emergency side of things. And you'll see a lot throughout the presentation that we'll see BEAR plan/report, and just know that different agencies say different things. Forest Service calls it a report, DOI calls it a plan. So if you hear me say plan or report, I'm referring to the same thing. The agency administrator is ultimately responsible for the report development and approval. Any ES project is going to require the submittal of an approved BEAR plan. And if you anticipate needing this, you're going to need to get started on this process sooner than later. I have a link down here that I'm not going to show you right now because we don't have time, but it has some good guidance on how the ordering process works. And this is also in your supplemental materials. There's a DOI national BEAR team that is dispatched to extreme incidents and can supplement your local incident as well. And if you think that you're going to be needing the national BEAR team, they need to be requested within 21 days. The Forest Service identifies a core BEAR team prior to fire season, and they have regional coordinators that can assist you at your local unit. So again, don't have to memorize everything. We don't have time to teach you the ins and outs, but just know the importance is knowing who to contact and when. Emergency stabilization means planned actions to address immediate post-fire emergency situations to protect live property, cultural and natural resources. Landscapes that are threatened from post-fire floods, debris flows, or are susceptible to serious degradation should be assessed and treated within that first year post-fire, because you're still dealing with that emergency situation. You're not talking about rehabilitation. And this is to emphasize that there are different timeframes for each agency. For example, for DOI, ES treatments have to be completed within 1 year and 21 days from the date of ignition, and Forest Service treatments have to be completed no later than 1 year after the fire containment date. I have these dates underlined in this slide because it's important for you as agency administrators to know that based on your agency, you might have a different date in your policy that you have to go off of, and these dates are going to need to be very clear in your written plans, and these dates are going to impact your funding. So I said date a lot in that slide, but please make sure you know which one you need for your policy, or for your agency, I mean, when you write your plan, and try to remember that that will impact your funding. I already mentioned treatments need to be in accordance with your land management plan, so I won't go through this slide in great detail. There are certain things that ES funds can be used for, and certain things that they can't be used for. You're going to need to reach out to your contacts when you're writing your plans to make sure that what you think is an emergency stabilization treatment actually does constitute as an emergency, so that it can be funded as such. And your local contacts will be able to help you make sure that this is straight and accurate in your plans. And when it comes to reporting, like I mentioned earlier, good note taking is going to help you when it comes time for your annual accomplishment reporting and your final report once the whole project is complete. Those are the two reports you can at least expect to be doing. This chart is simply just to show you that there are different funding levels and different levels of approval needed based on your agency in different time frames. And you have access to this slideshow, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on some of these. Okay, now we shift from emergency treatments into the rehabilitation and restoration portion. Rehabilitation, when we're talking about that, we're talking about efforts taken to repair or improve wildfire damaged lands unlikely to recover naturally. And any rehab efforts need to be taken per your agency policy. Burned area rehabilitation or BAR, for example, DOI, you have to do your rehab efforts within 5 years and 21 days after the date of ignition of the wildfire. And Forest Service, you have no later than 3 years after the containment date of the fire. And just a note on funding for BAR, burn area rehab, this gets funded on a year-to-year basis. So you might have planned in your BAR plan, I need X amount millions, and I'm going to need to charge this much this fiscal year and this much the next and the next for your set allowed time for your agency. But you're still going to need to submit an annual report and request that funding each year. And if you have unspent funding, you'll have to submit an annual report and request that be carried over. Please, I know this is a lot of information. It's the end of a long week. You don't have to memorize everything, but just know that dates impact your funding. These are some of the things that should go into your BAR plans. You're going to need to evaluate potential for long-term post-fire impacts to cultural and natural resources, develop and implement cost-effective plans to emulate historical or pre-fire ecosystem structure. I won't read through all of the bullets here. And for a DOI, we need to have a separate bar plan. So oftentimes we just combine emergency stabilization and bar plans into one plan, and the funding is different. Forest Service includes bar in their Bayer plans. Restoration is a long-term process. These are a few things to consider. How will you assist the recovery of the degraded ecosystem? How are you going to reclaim the habitat and ecosystem functions? You're ultimately trying to recreate, initiate, or accelerate ecosystem recovery. Most importantly, this is the responsibility of the agency administrator and not the fire program. And one of the things that I see happen a lot as we shift from our rehabilitation into our long-term restoration is the expectation from our agency administrators that the responsibility for this long-term restoration falls on the fire program, and it doesn't. It's your job as the AA to plan for this in your regular program of work and figure out where your priorities are and how you're going to fit this in. There's a lot of slides going here at the end that are just food for thought. I'm going to breeze through them fairly quick without reading through all of them. Just things to think about as you're building these plans. Human life and property impacts to those. Remember, safety is always your first priority. And there's a lot of things that happens with fires that can impact your communities and your visitors to your unit. Infrastructure, you're gonna most likely have impacts to your infrastructure. You need to know what these are and have these assessed, and your reads will be on top of this, I'm sure. What are your indirect impacts to your recreation, whether that's your campground, trail closures, altered and impeded waterways? Rangeland is a big one. We can see significant impacts to our rangeland from wildfire. Just remember that revegetated and recovering areas may need to be closed to livestock grazing to promote recovery. And if you're going to have closures, you have to inform your permittees while you're preparing the plan. This picture sums up the impacts that we can expect to see and plan for in our different plans and reports when it comes to a forest ecosystem. Timber products, this is in here because this is still an impact. And when it comes to emergency stabilization, I don't want to mislead you with this slide. Emergency stabilization doesn't cover salvage logging. So I don't want you to think because you're seeing a loaded truck in this image that salvage logging is okay. You can cut down hazard trees, but you can't remove the hazard trees with ES. We've talked about this in a few other areas, impacts to your watersheds, soil stabilization. Your treatments are going to address these issues. Wildlife habitat, this goes without saying. I'm sure you're already thinking about these on your local units. Your cultural archaeological resources, what are the impacts going to be to those, and what are you going to do to treat them? This will most likely be a big ticket item in your plans. What are you going to do about your native plants and your invasive species? I apologize for going through these slides quickly. Monitoring. The important thing to know is that we have to monitor by agency policy. I would refer to your specific agency guidebook or manual to look at how you need to monitor and what tools you need to use to monitor. And this monitoring data is going to provide the transition to your long-term recovery. or long-term restoration, excuse me. And your monitoring data is going to be key in your annual accomplishment reports and your final reports. Like I mentioned, this is our transition to long-term restoration. I'm sure as managers, you already have had these conversations in your various NEPA projects, but when it comes to post-fire, you need to be having these objectives as well, or deciding what's going to be your objective in your plan. Some of you I know don't have exposure to some of these treatments. The next handful of slides are just images. Again, it's just food for thought to get you thinking about what some of this looks like. Seeding, ground seeding, drill seeding, your areas can look very different. There's going to be differences between what you can do under ES and what you can do under VAR. You may decide that you want to do aerial seeding. That might be the best, most effective treatment for your unit. Just a note on this, agency administrators, if you have the aerial component, start talking to your FMOs early, because they're going to help guide you on all of the additional things you'll need to do when you bring in the aerial component. Reforestation, you can't do reforestation under emergency stabilization, but you can do it under rehabilitation. So, food for thought. Where are you going to need closures, fences, gates? Where are you going to need to post signs? Do you have washouts? What are you going to need to do again for your soil stabilization? These are just a few pictures of what that can look like. Water diversion and erosion control is most likely going to be in the forefront of your mind, and they will be already working on this in suppression repair, but you still need to have this accounted for in your plans. There's all kinds of different things you can do for water diversion and erosion prevention, as you can see from the photos. Some of you may have seen damaged facilities as the language used in the past. Now they're called damaged assets, damaged minor assets, and you can repair minor assets with ES and VAR. They have to be minor. We've talked about cultural already. That goes without saying. What are you going to need to do to protect those resources? Important thing about monitoring is that we have to do it. We have to do it. How you do it, when you do it, that's going to be agency specific, and the agency administrator is ultimately responsible for all reporting. I know that I've said this a few times. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I've seen multiple managers in recent history get some funding that was key to their program swept at the end of the fiscal year because they didn't keep the right notes and weren't able to submit appropriate annual reports. And when you don't submit an annual report, your funding can be delayed. And if you can't justify why you need that funding the following fiscal year, or why it went unspent in this current fiscal year, you might have it swept. This is in here just to show a good example of a success story. So nobody thought that Yellowstone National Park would recover. This is close to where I live, and I love this park. Many thought it would take a century to recover from the 1988 fires, but today the ecosystem is healthier and more resilient. Visitation is high and life flourishes in the burned forests. I apologize for having to run through that fairly quickly. I'm not sure if we actually have time for the group exercise.
Hey, Maya, there is
Yeah.
a question in the chat asking who's responsible for monitoring.
The agency administrator is ultimately responsible for ensuring that it happens.
Yeah, thank you. I asked that question before you came up on that slide, and then I saw the slide and I said, okay. I thought you
Oh,
were
I'm
just waiting until
sorry.
you got to the slide.
I
But
can't
it's-
see the chat right now on my screen.
It's okay. It's answered. Thank you.
Great. Matt, do we have time to do a group exercise or do we need to skip it?
We're right at time. How long do you think? Is it a few minutes or?
I gave them 10 minutes, a few minutes probably would work.
Okay. Hey, Eric, what do you think? Is that gonna put us too far back today? All right. Let's go for it.
Okay, just a few minutes. Don't answer all of the questions then. What I really want you to key in on this is who are your local contacts if you don't already know, because this is what is really going to expedite the process. So if you take a few minutes, talk about that with your groups, if you know who your local contacts are and what you would do for ESBAR.
Okay. So let's take a few minutes in your groups to do that, and then we'll be going into a break. So let's be back at 13:25.